I'm from the farms when single mothers had to fight to make sure I was safe from gunshots every night. Education as a nation, what they looking for, but dumb, young, stupid blacks is what they take us for. Man, you don't even know what I've been through. Bullets dipped in ink and that's only for pencils. You try to rip down what God created, looking for help, it was faded. Man, I thank God that I made it. I was raised to kill everything that I see, and I was taught to fight for my family. You gotta learn what's right and what's wrong. Berry Farms community, this is our opportunity. They built these houses for me and you. Berry Farms, I made this song for you.
Bring out the megaphones till everybody knows. We won't give up now. We got a history, pride and community. Nothing can erase our home, our home, our home. Nothing can erase our home, our home, our home. Nothing can erase our
It's crazy how the city just changed overnight, but I know that Berry Farms ain't going without a fight. Cause in the belly of the beast, you gotta fight for life. But what they doing in Southeast, it just ain't right. They displacing all the residents, raising up the rent. It's like they supposed to settle with the struggles they been living in. But I bet they didn't know about them boys. The farm's been around and they known to make noise, known to say oi, left with no choice, fighting with a government that plans to destroy the same place that raised the junkyard band. It's the neighborhood that even gave Howard bands. They don't talk about the land and all the history it has. The abolitionists that have came and passed, put their names on the street signs in hopes it lasts. But they trying to change that, they erasing the past.
our home, our home. Nothing can erase our home, our home, our home. Nothing can erase our home. Rise up like the morning sun, and shine some light on what's being done. Let's demand a plan that's truly for all of us, and we'll stand together. No, we're not alone. Bring out the megaphones till everybody knows. We won't give up now. We got a history, pride and community. Nothing can erase our home, our home, our home. Nothing can erase our home, our home, our home.
Good morning.
Nothing can erase our
I'm Ivan. Ivan Grove with People for Fairness. I think
Thank you for being on. We're gonna mute everybody right now though, okay? Thanks for being here, Ivan. Appreciate it.
because somebody texted me the information.
Okay, great.
Thinking.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're doing well on this a little bit gray day, but we're really happy that you all have joined us today. My name is Parisa Noruzi. I'm the director of Empower DC, and I'm happy to be here with my friends and comrades in the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition to share with you our preliminary analysis and thoughts on the latest draft of the comp plan that was released just Wednesday late in the day. So bear with us as we are just lay people like you, just trying to get our hands around this over 1,000 page document and really look at it with a critical eye about, you know, how will this actually change conditions in the city and advance racial equity. Just really briefly, I'm going to remind folks who are new, especially, that the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition is a citywide coalition of individuals and organizations. We formed about 4 years ago in the spring of 2017. We've been meeting every month dutifully, and we've engaged over 1,200 people in those meetings and in advocacy around strengthening the comprehensive plan. We developed housing justice priorities to guide that work, and then housing justice amendments where we offered specific language changes to the comp plan. We had over 35 organizations endorse that work, and we're guided by principles of racial equity, environmental justice, and equitable development. We want to see a transformation of the way that the city develops to make sure that people are benefiting, low-income Black and Brown people in particular, are benefiting from the development, not being displaced. And I'm sure you all know the comprehensive plan is this 1,000 plus page document. It's a 20-year framework that guides the development of the city. It has to be rewritten every 20 years. That's coming up again in 2026. Right now, we're in what's supposed to be an amendment cycle. However, there's been very significant changes made that are more on par with a rewrite. So we really have to watch this process closely. One of the reasons why the comp plan is so critical is because DC law says that when the zoning commission approves development, they cannot approve development that is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan. So that decision-making body that's deciding what development moves forward has to refer to this document. When the mayor started this amendment process 4 years ago, she made it very clear in the media and in the public that she wanted to stop the resident-led appeals that were happening, and we'll speak to that in a second. She also wanted to allow greater density, in other words, bigger buildings, and advance more development projects. And she also more recently stated her housing goals: 36,000 new units of housing, with 12,000 of those considered affordable, although we question affordable to who. Let's be reminded that this is in the context of a city that displaced 40,000 Black residents just in 10 years' time, according to the census. From 2000 to 2010 alone, 40,000 Black residents were displaced. And that was largely as a result of development decisions, the demolition of public housing, the investment in luxury housing that contributed to rising rents and land values across the city that made it hard for low-income people to continue to live here. But see, our priorities then for the comp plan are to stop that displacement of Black and Brown residents. We want to make sure that the plan requires the development of housing for the lowest incomes. We can't just say affordable housing, right? We have to be specific about who needs the housing. We need to build housing for incomes at 30% of the median family income and below. We have 30% of DC renters that cannot afford more than $900 in rent. We have tens of thousands of people who cannot afford more than $900 in rent. And as you all know, our market rents are far above that. And we want to transform the way that we develop. We want to promote community-led equitable development. We know that there is another way to develop that brings the things that people need: the affordable housing, the grocery stores, the community centers. And we don't always have to rely on major developers and giving them big land and money subsidies to do that. We can also invest in community economic development. When the mayor released her amendments, they were largely along these lines: the weakening of language meant to undermine any appeals brought by residents. I mentioned that earlier, that just in recent years, because of that real frustration by communities across the city that displacement was occurring without any safeguards, some residents, for instance, like the Berry Farm tenants and allies, banded together and used the appeal process to go to the courts and say, hey, courts, the zoning commission is not following the rules. They have not looked at the provisions of the comp plan when they've approved this development. The mayor's intention in her amendments is to weaken the language in the plan so that if you do go to the courts, they cannot be decisive about what the plan intends. So if the plan says you shall do this, then the courts can say, oh yes, you shall. That's a rule. But if it says you should, then it's looked at as guidance, and the courts would be unlikely to rule in favor of residents in that case. The mayor also changed what's called the future land use map throughout the city, allowing greater density or different types of housing of development. For instance, changing industrial land to residential land or commercial land to residential land across the city. And most of those came at the request of developers. The reason why that's concerning is that the future land use map is not meant to be for spot zoning. It's not meant to be for individual development projects to move forward. It is meant to be based on community planning that identifies the types of land use that are desired and should include things like green space, right? Identification of what density levels are appropriate, et cetera. So when we allow developers to drive that process by changing the future land use map outside of any community planning and spot zoning for them, that is problematic. Her changes also defined affordable housing as housing up to 120% of the median family income. So we're talking about families that might earn in over $100,000 a year and be far above the median income for DC residents as a whole and Black DC residents in particular. She also replaced public housing with affordable housing and built upon a false narrative that just building more market rate housing is going to alleviate our city's affordable housing needs. So some of these are things that we're going to get into more as we go forward. As we evaluate the changes, these are the key questions that we've asked ourselves. We want to know, will these changes prioritize the building of housing for DC's lowest income residents, 30% AMI or MFI and below? We want to know, does this plan mean that we will have more low income housing? Does this plan promote non-market driven strategies to achieve affordable housing? Or are we going to continue to rely on this so-called trickle down method with subsidizing big for-profit developers? Does the plan enhance the public's ability to shape the development decisions that impact their communities? Does it create a pathway for community-led equitable development that improves economic conditions for the communities most immediately at risk of displacement? Are we allowing people's economic conditions to be transformed, or are we keeping people in poverty? Are we preventing the displacement of residents, particularly Black and Brown residents? And are we meaningfully advancing racial equity? So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Renee Bowser, and she's going to get a little bit into our first question. Renee, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Parisa, and hello, everyone. I went through the housing element and looked at the changes that the Committee of the Whole added to the Office of Planning's draft. And while we do see some improvement in the definition of affordable housing, the mayor's definition of affordable housing went up to 120% of the median family income, which for a family of four is $151,000 as of 2020. And the chairman's definition of affordable housing moves that from 0% to 80% median family income. So it focuses more on the cap is low income families. Now, we believe that that does not go far enough, because here in the District of Columbia, we have such a income gap and wealth gap between Black, white, and Latino families. The Black median income is $42,000 as of 2020, which means that half of Black people in the city their families make less than $42,000 a year. And so that means that we are in the extremely low and very low income categories. So we believe that we have to focus on those categories for housing and economic development. And at times there's a use of moderate or lower income which would allow, again, building up to 120% of the median family income as subsidized housing. So we believe that the definition of affordable housing has to be more focused on the people, nearly 40,000 people who make 37,000 or less. Their households make 37,000 or less annually. We cannot improve the city as a whole if we're not focusing on the most needy. If someone has cancer, we work on that. We don't work on their just a rash. We work on the serious issues. So also we have the City Committee of the Whole saying that low and moderate income housing is a civic priority. Again, there's no focus on the people who really need the housing assistance. And we have both the OP and COW draft saying that 1/3 of new housing should be affordable to 80% of the median family income, which means 2/3 are for people that are above 80%, which does not, again, focus on the importance of the conditions. And the New Communities Initiative, which includes Greenleaf, it includes Park Morton, it stresses redeveloping those communities, which are very extremely low income communities, i.e. households that even a family of 4 only makes $37,000 a year. It shifts the focus from providing housing and economic opportunities to those communities to all income levels. And so that does not help. The worst part of this document, including the most recent draft from the Committee of the Whole, is public housing. The failure to focus on public housing, which we know is safety net housing for the poorest people. We have our city government saying, when there's redevelopment, we've let these public housing developments go to deterioration. But when we redevelop them, we're not going to redevelop them for the people who are living there and suffering there. We're going to redevelop them for higher incomes because it replaces public housing with affordable housing. I have to say that the Committee of the Whole draft improves upon that because they limit affordable housing to 80% of the AMI, but that's still a single person who makes $70,000 a year. When the target audience should be people at 0 to 30 and 31 to 50% of the median family income. We are very happy that the Committee of the Whole draft restores community land trusts. However, we need it to be focused on lower income households because those are the households that need the help. And the draft focuses on moderate income district residents as well as low income district residents. And we also found that the findings of the limited equity cooperative study have not been included. Okay, just a second here. Oh, one of the things that the Committee of the Whole added was to inform and engage public housing residents throughout the transformation process. That is not community-led development. What we're seeking is to have people who are directly impacted lead what they need, they know they need to upgrade their communities. And for example, the Barry Farm Tenants and Allies Association had an economic package with their housing proposal. So do the Park Morton Resident Council have an economic package. They need to be in the lead of how the housing and development around their existing communities will be replaced. And we have to say that we have to have one-for-one replacement of public housing units with housing units that public housing level income residents can afford. And there must be build first. We cannot minimize displacement. We have to avoid displacement, and it's possible to do so, particularly in projects like Park Morton, when there are 2 vacant buildings on the Park Morton site that could be redeveloped, and the public housing residents could be placed in those buildings. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Renee. And just to add to this last slide, these are principles, the implementation of one-for-one replacement of affordable units or building first to prevent displacement. These have been principles of the New Communities Initiative. The problem is it's never actually been done. They've never built first, and they've never replaced the units one for one at levels affordable to returning public housing residents. So this just underscores why the language in the comp plan has to provide a mandate. It has to be, a requirement, not just implement as many strategies as possible, but they should have to, go through great effort to not be able to do these things, right? This should be the standard. Otherwise, we are not addressing the ongoing displacement of low-income people, public housing residents in particular. I'm going to turn it over to Andrea Rosen now for a little talk on rent control.
Thank you. We're pleased to see new text in the Housing Elements rent control policy affirming rent control as a tenant protection and anti-displacement tool. The amendment counsels the government against considering rent control units when defining or assessing progress towards affordable housing protection and preservation goals. So this seems hopeful. However, I would offer a couple of suggestions. Changing instances of the verb should to shall would be useful here. And additionally, we would like to see the language strengthened to explicitly exclude the possibility that when tenants voluntarily vacate rent-controlled units and thus are not displaced, the units may afterwards be converted to subsidized, dedicated, affordable housing, which was actually the subject of a bill that was introduced a year or so ago. The bill did not get passed, but it doesn't mean such a bill might not come up again and actually be passed. And finally, just as a sidebar, this amendment does not eliminate the need for the council to address legislatively the problems that have become evident in the current rent control law. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Andrea. And Andrea's last point there applies to most of what we're speaking of. There are certain things that the comp plan can accomplish itself because the zoning commission does have to comply with it. However, there are many ideas in the comp plan that need to be articulated through policy, through separate legislation, the details of which need to be shown through separate legislation. So as we get through the comprehensive plan process, just know that the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition will continue to work along those lines, and we hope to have your involvement. Next, we have William Jordan.
Good afternoon. My name is William Jordan. I'm a resident of Columbia Heights in neighborhood. And so I'm here to talk about the what we call community-led development and its impact and the writing of the comp plan and updating of the comp plan. And so first I wanted to say that the work that the committee has done has really, compared to what the Office of Planning did, is basically moving from nighttime to early morning. We're starting to see some light. But what we're here to do is to get this plan and these efforts to the full light of day, particularly when it comes to racial equity. I think one of the things that we're talking about today in this comp plan is, can we build a city that is prosperous, safe for white residents, but for Black residents who are being displaced. We've had 20 years of policy, as Parisa has said, where we say that 40,000 Black residents have been displaced from the city. And actually, that number is an underestimate. That is most likely just Ward 1 and 2 was 40,000. But as we move forward and we look at racial equity, one of the ways the Grassroots Planning Coalition is suggesting that we look at achieving racial equity is through community-led development. And so with the comp plan, we're starting to look at, and one of those places to do it is as we, one, preserve public housing, but when public housing is going to be renovated, then residents need to have full engagement in that process. And so this is kind of language we see, but we go further. The residents not just have engagement, they need to be full partners in the process in order to engage. And so we're asking to see language in the comp plan as we move forward that not just refers to something like that, but actually says the residents must have an equitable position. Your voice doesn't count if you don't have an equity position in the process. So a couple things on that slide as well I wanted to refer to before going to the next one is you'll notice that the first policy has an H, and that comes from the housing element, whereas the other elements have LU and they focus on the land use element. So one of the things we have to do in order to get to racial equity in the comp plan, you have to look through multiple sections and see how they layer and come together to have an impact. And that's just the theory. Then the next step is when proposals are made by the government and funded by the government and go through the zoning commission, they have to evaluate whether these things make sense, where they will work on the ground. So we can move to the next slide. So in this case, what we see is the language I referred to earlier, is that in the comp plan, the Committee of the Whole has done an excellent job. It says, in this case with public housing redevelopment, provide opportunities for Park Morton residents to access ownership opportunities on the redevelopment sites within their community. So what that means is they recommend, they hope, this is something that needs to happen, but we need the word must, and this is what the residents have done. They've created their own plan and say that they must. And there are other communities such as Berry Farm, Greenleaf, this is another public housing place that's about to come up for redevelopment as well. Not public housing, but similar is Brooklyn Manor. And in all of these cases, for instance, with Park Morton, the city is going to invest $100 million in public money and give it to a developer to execute. That money needs to go to residents to allow them to do so. Similarly at Brooklyn Manor, which is not public housing, but a similar situation, the city is putting $56 million into the deal, but the residents don't have a say. So we're asking that as we review, as we go through and look at, and we talk about racial equity, that racial equity can only happen if the residents and community members, particularly Black families, have an equity position, particularly when city land and resources is put into place. And while, again, the Committee of the Whole and their racial equity analysis has come a long way from where OP, which almost is just oh, well, let's do racial equity. Whereas at least the Committee of the Whole has said, let's do some concrete things to measure whether racial equity is happening in our city. In the Grassroots Planning Coalition and our efforts to change the language will be to do it, to not just measure it, but to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William. We're going to talk a little bit more now about how the amended plan addresses displacement and Racial Equity. Chris Williams is going to speak next.
Thank you, Parissa. The city, as you can see, is proposing additional tracking of data. And so action H, which is in the housing element, is to look at changes by neighborhood, changes in housing costs, disaggregation of data along income and racial characteristics. This is better than what we had, as William stated, but let us be clear. Much of this data the federal government is already tracking. We already know what rent burden looks like by neighborhood for the last 10 years and the patterns there. We know by neighborhood the number of Black people there were 10 years ago and what that looks like today. So we have a lot of data that they are proposing. They are not choosing to avail themselves of that data. And yes, it may be good in some instances to collect data that is not otherwise available. But what we are saying is that we want to see greater accountability for the displacement of 40,000 African Americans and revisions to the comprehensive plan. And so what we are looking for is where the rubber meets the road. And so these changes do not prohibit displacement, nor do they require measures to limit displacement or to create new tools to prevent displacement. Preventing displacement is encouraged, but not required. So this is not a change in the status quo. Build First has been long been suggested for public housing redevelopments, but as Parissa stated, that has not taken place to date. So we need greater accountability. We need stronger language to really make it more convincing and to persuade us in the public that in fact, the district is ready to turn a corner on displacement. Because what we see now is that the developers are very accelerated in their efforts to get their projects approved. And so we are pretending more displacement. And how do we, the public, get more guarantees that the status quo will be changed? We now have the next slide, and it talks about equity tools. It talks about the equity crosswalk. And while we appreciate the heavy nod to equity and racial equity in the comprehensive plan put forth by Mr. Mendelson, these changes are serious. They are not projected ideas for right now. We don't want more overtures to racial equity that are to be implemented in years from now, because we know that developers are aggressively trying to get their projects approved all across the city. And they're not putting in the level of affordability that we need. And when they do put in the level of affordability, again, it is far beyond where Black median household income is. So Black communities don't have time to wait. That is, the comp plan changes call for further discussion and implementation to achieve racial equity sometime in the future, and perhaps long after the comprehensive plan that impact the lives of people today. And so thank you, Parissa.
Thank you, Chris, so much for your input. And, I want to mention that just as we've been on the call, the chairman has released the committee report for the comprehensive plan. So as mentioned, the council will have a markup on this tomorrow. The new council office on racial equity has completed a racial equity impact assessment, and it is included in the committee report. I've just pulled it up, so I have not read it yet, but the first sentence says, conclusion, as introduced, Bill 24-0001 will exacerbate racial inequalities in the District of Columbia. And then there follows analysis that we all need to take a look at. But this again is another vindication for what we've been saying, that while racial equity has been strengthened through the concept being added, we haven't gone far enough to actually change the practice that we're using in the city for how we develop. We're going to just go a couple more slides here. So the thesis statement for us is that equity cannot be an afterthought. It has to be the driving intention of the legislation, that the equity has to be inherent in the process and in the outcome. And so while the council, and we commend the council, especially the chairman's office, and let me shout out his staff person, Julia Coster, because I know it's an incredibly difficult task to go through this document and weigh the different input. While they have included dozens of references to racial equity, the requirements of development have not substantially been changed. And because we know that racial equity is inherent in the process as well as the outcome, that's important. We can't put racial equity at the end. It has to be at the beginning. A prime example of this is how the future land use map would allow changes now, but then say that planning with a racial equity lens should happen later. So if we're, that's of course, putting the cart before the horse. We need to do that planning now and mitigate displacement, mitigate, the different issues that we've had historically, and then we can change the maps and do the development. Otherwise, we will continue to see the same outcomes that we've had. So as we move forward in this process, we will be hoping to work with you and the council members to put in stronger language that ensures clear requirements for building 30% MFI housing, not just referring to affordable housing, but really getting specific about how much low-income housing we need in the city. We want to make those mandates clear about build first and one-for-one replacement, not make it a suggestion. We need to detail that process for involvement of the impacted community and create real pathways for residents to have equity, have an equity stake that economically changes people's lives. We want to promote more of these non-market strategies that we know that we can use in the city, like land trusts and cooperatives. We need to develop new tools to prevent displacement. It cannot just be a attempt to prevent displacement. We need tools and specific mandates for doing that. And then finally, this is very important because it gets this last point about where does equity come in the process. There's been a lot of debate about what is the impact of the changes to the future land use map. It's hard to explain because there's so many different nuances, different types of changes. It depends what type of land use change is happening, depends who applies for it, et cetera, et cetera. So the way to resolve this issue and ensure that there is always an opportunity for the community to engage and to negotiate strong community benefit agreements is to require that all zoning changes be contested cases. Contested meaning that it's not just a rubber stamp, but that there's a hearing, that there's a negotiation that takes place, and that there is a binding order by the zoning commission that is enforceable. That binding order would lay out what the benefits are, and that would be enforceable. If we don't protect for that, we will have a number of projects that will move forward without any community benefit agreements or any opportunity to hold developers accountable for the affordable units, for the job creation, for the different things that communities are promised. So we have the markup tomorrow at noon. You can tune into it on the dccouncil.us website. We are expecting, the chairman has expected that there would be a first reading on May 4th where they'll take a vote, and then possibly a second vote thereafter on May 18th before the mayor's budget comes out. The DC Grassroots Planning Coalition will have our meeting this Saturday, and at that time, we welcome our partners to ask questions and get more in depth in discussion. We're not going to do a lot of that today. What we're going to do, though, is open it to any members of the press or council offices that are present who might have a question or desire for clarification. If so, please raise your hand. I can see you. Okay. Okay, well, we encourage if there are any questions from the press or the council offices to please contact us. The contact information is there, my email address and phone number. We're not going to do discussion with the full group right now because this was meant to be a short briefing. But we will follow this up by sending this presentation out. We will send you a link to the committee report that just came out with the racial equity analysis. And we ask that you make time on your calendar to join us Saturday at 1 p.m. so that we can continue this work together. And thank you so much, Dr. Hewitt. It's really exciting to have Dr. Hewitt, the city's first Chief Equity Officer, tuning in, and we really look forward to working with you, Dr. Hewitt. As well, we want to shout out Brian McClure, the Director of the Council Office on Racial Equity. We know it was a very big task for his staff to put together this racial equity impact assessment of the comprehensive plan. You know, I think it's about 1,500 pages now with amendments. So we will make this recording available. We will make the presentation available. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. Now, please be mindful that we will be calling for action to a week of action following our meeting Saturday. That following week, April 26th, the week of April 26th, will be a week of action on the comprehensive plan. We'll be pushing for these types of changes in the document. We want to thank you all so much. We know this is a busy time for everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Appreciate all of your support. And we look forward to working with you as we go through the remaining steps of the process. Thank you, everybody.